Now, rendering our list like this is of course not our goal. We want to render a more beautiful, a more good-looking list. And for this, we could structure our code here differently and add more styling, but ultimately, I simply want to create a new component here and add component-specific styling. So that's what we'll do. In the components folder, I'll add another subfolder next to layout, and I'll name it meetups. And this holds all my meetup-specific code. And in there, I'll add a meetup item.js file and a meetup list.js file, because I want to outsource both the list as well as the individual list items into components. Because, as mentioned earlier, it is a good practice to split your components and your application as a whole into small, reusable pieces. Now let's start with the meetup item. In that file, we create our meetup item function, of course, as we did before, and we export that function. And then in here, we return a list item. And then in that list item, I want to have a div in which I render the image and set the source to something and the alt text to something. And then that's a self-closing element. And below that div, I have another div with the content, where I have a h3 tag with the title, an address tag, which is a default HTML tag, where I output the address later, and then a paragraph with the description. And all this hard-coded text will, of course, soon be replaced with dynamic data. And then below that, we can add another div with a button where we say to favorites, so that this adds the item to our favorites later. That's the general structure I want to have here. Now, as mentioned, title, address, and description, and also the data for the image should be dynamic. I don't want to hard code it here. Instead, it should be passed in from outside, from the so-called parent component, so the component where we use this component in its JSX code. And we learned how we can make that happen. We can accept props here and use props. And then, for example, for the image source, we could set this to props.image, expecting an image prop on the meetup item which holds that URL that should be set as a source here. And the same for the alt text, that could be our title. The title can also be used down there, so that we output props.title here. And for the address, it's props.address. For the description, it's props.description. And now, all of a sudden, this component is reusable and dynamic. Some styling would also be nice, and for that, again attached, you find CSS files here, the meetup item.module CSS and the meetup list.module CSS files, which you can copy in next to these JavaScript files. And then in meetup item.js, we want to import classes from /meetup item.module.css and assign a couple of classes in that JavaScript file. On the list item, for example, we'll add the item class like this. On this div, which is wrapped around the image, we'll add the image class like this. On the div, which is wrapped around the title and description and so on, we'll add the content class. And then down there for the button, I'll add a class of actions like this. Now that's not all. I also want to work on that meetup list component already. So here we can again create another component, meetup list, and export that as a default. Also accept props here, because I expect to get that list data from outside as well. And I'm expecting this because I'm the one building this app. We could also write the code for fetching meetups in this component, but I instead want to make this component reusable and not care about the data source in here, but instead just expect that I get meetups through some prop, and then it's the component which uses the meetup list component that has to worry about getting the meetups. And I'm setting it up like this because I plan on using the meetup list component in the all meetups component and also in the favorites component later. And there we'll have different data sources, but the same way of displaying the data. And that's what we can make work by adding a separate reusable component. In here, I also already want to import classes from /meetup_list.module.css and return an unordered list here, which receives a class name of classes.list, which is one of the only provided CSS class for this component. And inside of the unordered list here, I now want to output my meetup items in the same way as we did it in all meetups, by mapping an array of objects into an array of JSX elements. Just that the JSX elements will now be the list items. And for this here, we again add a dynamic expression with curly braces, and we can expect that on our props here in meetup list, we get, let's say, a meetups prop. The name is up to you because it's your component. This could also be named items, but here I'll go with meetups. And then I map every meetup into another object, into a JSX element to be precise. So therefore, using the arrow function shorthand syntax here, I'll transform every meetup into a meetup item. And for this, you need to add this import. It was automatically added for me here by the IDE. If that does not work for you, just add it manually and import meetup item from the meetup item file. Now we render one meetup item per object in the meetups array, and that now needs to be configured. It needs this key prop, this special prop React expects, one of the very few special props that are built into React and that can be used on any component, including your own components, without you writing any special code for it inside of your components. So you can just add that anywhere. And we set that equal to meetup.id. Then in my own component, I'll actually pass in the ID as well as an ID prop. We will use that later for the favorite feature. I'll pass in the image prop with meetup.image. Let me reformat this to make it a bit more readable. Add the title prop and point at meetup.title. And also add address and description. So meetup.address and description is equal to meetup.description. Now, alternatively, we could have also just passed in a meetup prop or any other name and just passed in the meetup as a whole. Then we would have to destructure it inside of the meetup item component. It's up to you which approach you prefer. Here I'm passing in individual props. With all of that done though, we can go back to all meetups and now use the meetup list component instead of the unordered list. So we go up and we import meetup list from going up one level out of the pages folder into the components folder, into the meetups folder to meetup list, and then just output meetup list like this, and very important, provide the meetups prop because we're expecting that prop inside of the meetup list component here. So set up the meetups prop here and pass in the dummy data array as a value. With all of that done, if you save all the files, you should see something like this. Now, this is not the final look. We'll continue tweaking this, but it shows that our content is being rendered, and that's not too bad. But now it would be nice to kind of restrict the width which we use on the screen, and it would also be nice if the individual meetups would look like cards with a nice drop shadow, maybe rounded corners, something like that. That's what we're going to add next.